The Institute helps young scholars through workshops, mentoring, networking, and organizing conferences such as the one today, where we had 2 panels of alumni from our workshops.
I'm an alumni for the Ronald Coase Institute. I went there in 2001, one of the first, I guess, institutes in Rio. And after that, like a year or 2 years after, I started to be a faculty, and I've been engaged until this year, twice this year. But after 20 years of reform, there's something new that I want to capture here, which is the fact that many times reforms are adopted and then are reverted, okay? And that seems to be very costly for society. And if you now think in terms of a modeling, you have to go back to the literature and revisit that, because the probability that the reform is reversed has to be taken into account also at the time of adopting the reform. So that's one thing that we are doing here, is to really write a fully Markovian dynamic model of the political economy of reform. But the second thing that strikes me as not taken into account back then, and important at the time of reform, but also at the time of the possibility of a reversal of a reform, is the role of external organizations.
So the question that motivates this paper is, how do land arrangements affect armed conflict? Now, this is actually a very old and long-standing question in the literature, and it's so old that it was occupying the minds of prominent guerrilla leaders such as Mao and Che, who were very interested in knowing which type of peasant or peasants living under which arrangement would be more likely or more susceptible to the revolutionary appeals. Now, you can see that that's a matter of life or death to them. But also, it was a question of a lot of research done during the 60s and 70s that tried to address this concern.
In the paper, we challenged the widespread belief that people in poorly governed countries are cursed by their natural resources. We challenged a more particular or specific variant of that belief, that international demand for resources from poorly governed countries leads to more violent conflicts. In fact, we show that's not the case in the Congo, and suggest whether or not that's a case more generally would depend on the specific context that we're addressing. We think the evidence is pretty strong that Dodd-Frank increased violence in the short run. We conclude our analysis in 2012. That's how long our data extend. The law was passed in 2010. In that window, we think the evidence is pretty strong that it caused more violence. The long-term effects remain to be seen. In the case of the Congo, it's extremely unfortunate that there's violence and acts of brutality to control the minerals, but this may be a case where the corrective action made things worse rather than better.
Why do local government provide rural residents with social welfare benefits? This question is puzzling to me because one thing is China is still authoritarian regime, so local officials do not face the election pressure. Instead, their career prospects in China are determined by the cadre evaluation system. Basically, the officials are evaluated every year based on a number of yardsticks.
We like to think that in well-behaved private environments, inefficiencies would be arbitraged away, would be resolved through bargaining, etc. So the question is, why doesn't the same reasoning apply to political environments as well? Why doesn't some version of the Coase theorem, if you will, doesn't translate into Egypt's political reality. And my answer in this particular case has to do with policy credibility. In order to be successful, efficiency-enhancing reforms need to be perceived as credible by some part of the population. And there are reasons to believe, as I'll try to explain, that in Egypt's case, it is a lack of policy credibility that's crippling the efforts to phase out subsidies.
So that's kind of the puzzle there, right? If you think about China, it really has weak institutions, right? But then why economic growth has been so dramatic? In conclude, I have to say, looking at the evolution of institutions and how institutions work in China, we can have a better understand of this Coasean approach to economic research. That is, you have to look at the real world. You start with the real world and look at how the real world works. And I believe by looking at the real world, we are going to get a deeper understanding about how institutions work. Thank you.